nascent years of the 14th century, the island of Britain was a land of division, not unity. It existed as a fractured mosaic of realms, where a single, ambitious crown sought the utter subjugation of all others. This was the England of King Edward I, a monarch whose will was as unbending as iron, a king who earned the moniker, Hammer of the Scots, through relentless, brutal ambition. His expansion was not merely a conquest of land, it was a crusade for the soul of a nation. Edward's desire was not for territory alone, but for complete and total submission. He didn't just want Scotland defeated on the battlefield, he wanted its people spiritually broken, convinced that their surrender was not only a practical inevitability but a righteous, divinely ordained conclusion. Scotland, in this moment of existential threat, was a nation in disarray. Its monarchy had crumbled into ruin, its powerful nobles were a hornet's nest of splintered factions and self-interest, and its people stood bewildered and divided. In such a profound vacuum of leadership and hope, any form of meaningful resistance appeared to be an act of pure futility, a death wish against an unstoppable tide. That is, until one man emerged from the periphery. He held no grand title, possessed no noble bloodline, and had no legitimate claim to the Scottish throne that he might use to rally the disparate lords. He did not step onto the stage of history as a potential king, but as a force of pure disruption, an anomaly that the rigid hierarchies of the age could not comprehend. This story is not a romantic legend spun in the comfort of hindsight. It is a harsh, unyielding lesson, one carved into the very flesh and bone of history. The saga of William Wallace is not a simple tale of rebellion against tyranny. It is a clinical examination of what a sprawling, confident empire does when confronted with a defiance that simply refuses to be extinguished. It is a study in the anatomy of power, revealing the brutal calculus an empire employs not merely to kill a man, but to systematically and utterly erase the very idea of him from the world. William Wallace was not born into the gilded halls of power, he was born into the quiet shadows of obscurity. As the son of a minor landowner, he had no ancestral lineage to boast of, no inherited seat in the royal courts, and no access to the corridors of influence. He was a product of the forgotten edges of medieval society. By the standards of his time, he was a nobody. He possessed no formal military education, was devoid of any significant political patronage, and had no logical reason to ever become a credible threat to a monarch as powerful as Edward I. And that, paradoxically, is what made him profoundly dangerous. His obscurity was a form of camouflage. Unburdened by the complex loyalties and delicate compromises of the nobility, he was free to act with a clarity and purpose that startled his enemies. In the year 1297, this unknown man from the fringes orchestrated a masterful and shocking guerrilla campaign, striking with vicious precision against the occupying English forces that garrisoned his homeland. The culmination of this campaign came at Stirling Bridge. There, Wallace's hastily assembled army, a motley collection of farmers, commoners, and outlaws, faced a professional English force that was vastly superior in numbers, training, and equipment. Against all odds, they delivered a crushing, annihilating defeat to the English. The victory was more than a strategic setback for England, it was a source of profound humiliation for Edward's decorated generals. These were men steeped in the rigid codes of chivalric warfare, knights and lords who believed in a divinely sanctioned order of battle, and they had been utterly outmaneuvered and decimated by a man they considered to be little more than a peasant savage. But the sting of defeat was secondary to what the victory at Stirling Bridge gave to Wallace. It gave him the one thing an empire cannot control, a legend. In the immediate aftermath, in a move born of desperate necessity rather than courtly ceremony, Wallace was knighted and proclaimed the Guardian of Scotland. It was a title drenched not in ancient tradition, but in the urgent, pressing need for a leader who could embody the nation's will to survive. For one brief, brilliant, and dangerously volatile moment, William Wallace ceased to be just a man. He became a movement. He was the living, breathing, defiant voice of a nation that was steadfastly, stubbornly refusing to kneel. But power, especially power born of righteous fury, is a fragile and fleeting thing. Because Wallace's most formidable weapon was never his sword or his military acumen. It was the dangerous, infectious idea that the mighty English war machine could be challenged, and that it could be beaten. Wallace's victories did more than just wound England's military pride. They fundamentally disrupted the Empire's carefully constructed narrative of invincibility. King Edward I was no longer simply waging a war against a provincial rebel. He was locked in a desperate battle against a symbol. A commoner, a man from the dirt, had risen to command armies, to publicly embarrass the nobility, and to rally a nation that had been shattered and broken. To an empire whose very foundations were built upon the bedrock of social hierarchy and the strategic application of fear, this was not just a challenge. It was an intolerable heresy. Hien tien tring tu duay. Even after Wallace suffered devastating military setbacks and the bitter sting of betrayal by fellow Scottish nobles who chose compromise over continued conflict, he did not simply vanish into obscurity. While others surrendered their swords, negotiated for peace, or bent the knee to Edward, Wallace refused. He disappeared into the hills and forests of his homeland, transforming from a general into a ghost, from a leader into a legend. His mere survival became a quiet, infuriating, and persistent act of defiance. For years, he was the phantom the English could not ensnare, the living myth their propaganda could not erase. This relentless persistence, this refusal to accept the imperial script that declared his cause lost, became his ultimate and unforgivable crime. It was not treason in the conventional sense, nor murder, but the simple, unyielding act of resisting fate. He had shown the world that the Empire's fear could be refused, that its power was not absolute, and that submission was a choice, not a destiny. When Wallace was finally captured in 1305, it was not on a blood-soaked battlefield in a final, glorious charge. There was no dramatic last stand. He was taken quietly, betrayed behind closed doors by John de Menteith, a Scottish noble who had cynically thrown his allegiance in with King Edward. From the very moment of his capture, Wallace ceased to be treated as a prisoner of war or even as a man. He became property of the English crown, a living object to be methodically displayed, publicly dismantled, and ultimately discarded as a warning to all. Bound in heavy chains and shackles, he began his final journey, a long, slow procession from Scotland to the heart of the Empire in London. This was no swift and hidden transfer. He was deliberately paraded through every village and town along the route, his capture advertised as a triumph. The journey's pace was agonizingly slow, a calculated decision to maximize his suffering and public humiliation. Crowds were not merely allowed to gather, they were actively encouraged to participate in his degradation, to jeer, to spit, to hurl rocks and filth at the bound figure. Wallace was tied to a horse, sometimes forced to ride bareback, his skin chafed and rubbed raw, his body systematically deprived of adequate food, water, and sleep. This was not a prisoner transfer, it was a protracted act of psychological warfare, designed to break his spirit and strip him of his heroic aura layer by layer. By the time the procession finally crawled into the sprawling, chaotic city of London, Wallace had been expertly softened, not yet physically broken, but mentally and emotionally ground down by the relentless, state-sanctioned torment. The trial that awaited him was no trial at all. Held in the cavernous, imposing Westminster Hall, the very seat of English royal justice, the event was pure political theater from its first moment to its last. The outcome had been decided long before he arrived. He was systematically denied every basic tenet of justice, he was forbidden from calling witnesses, barred from mounting a defense, and stripped of all dignity. A garland of oak leaves was mockingly placed on his head, a gesture to ridicule him as an outlaw king of the forests. The charges were read out, a litany of crimes designed to paint him as a monster, treason against the king, sacrilege against the church, and unrestrained barbarism in his conduct of war. Throughout this charade, Wallace remained largely silent. But when pressed for a plea on the charge of treason, he finally delivered his only answer. His voice, though weakened, echoed through the great hall with unshakable conviction. "Could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." In that single, defiant sentence, he shattered the entire illusion of the proceedings. He wasn't pleading his innocence under English law, he was denying the validity of that law itself. He had not merely broken the king's rules, he had publicly and unequivocally denied the king's very right to rule him or his people. This was an ideological challenge of the highest order, an attack on the very foundation of Edward's authority. And for that ultimate act of defiance, he would not simply be put to death. He would be unmade. Wallace's sentence was not to be a mere execution. It was to be a disassembly, a ritualistic deconstruction of a human being, crafted to erase him from existence piece by excruciating piece. On August 23, 1305, the final act of this imperial drama began. The execution commenced not with the swift mercy of a blade, but with the grinding friction of a rope. Stripped nearly naked before the jeering mob, his wrists and ankles securely bound, Wallace was tied behind a horse and dragged from Westminster through the squalid, dung-caked streets of London. This procession of agony was no chaotic outburst of medieval bloodlust, it was a calculated and deliberate policy, a ritual of humiliation meticulously designed to transform a man's pain into a public performance. The route deliberately snaked through the city's most crowded districts, ensuring the largest possible audience. The very ground became a weapon against him, as the mud, sharp stones, and filth of the streets tore at his exposed body. Spectators, who had been conditioned by the crown's narrative to see him not as a patriot but as a grotesque monster, watched the spectacle with a mixture of morbid glee and cold indifference. Each jolt across the cobblestones, each searing lash of pain, was a lesson written in his flesh for all to read. This is the fate of those who defy the English crown. By the time he reached Smithfield, a sprawling market square normally used for trading livestock, his body was a mangled canvas of bruises, blood, and brokenness. But more importantly, his identity had been systematically stripped away. He was no longer the guardian of Scotland, the victor of Stirling Bridge. He was now just meat, dragged through the capital of the empire to be offered up as a bloody spectacle. The crowd was not there for justice, they were there to witness the raw, terrifying face of state power, and the true horror had not yet even begun. At Smithfield, William Wallace was hoisted up, barely alive, a broken figure at the center of a theater of cruelty. The crowd pressed in, hungry for the promised show. First, he was hanged, but not to kill him. He was hoisted slowly by the neck, left to choke, convulse, and struggle for air, his face swelling and discoloring as life began to fade. Then, just moments before he would have lost consciousness, he was cut down and dropped to the ground, gasping. What followed was a descent into methodical, ritualistic cruelty. A small, hooked blade was produced, a tool designed not for mercy but for maximum pain. Wallace was castrated, and his severed genitals were held up to the crowd before being burned in a fire in front of him, a symbolic act designed to erase his manhood and his lineage from history. Then came the evisceration. The executioner sliced his abdomen open, reached inside, and began to slowly draw out his intestines, inch by agonizing inch, throwing them into the same fire. Contemporary chroniclers, recording the event with chilling detachment, noted that his eyes, still lucid, followed the movement, forcing him to remain a conscious witness to his own disembowelment. Finally, as the ultimate symbolic gesture, his heart, the very symbol of his legendary courage, was carved from his chest and cast into the flames. But even this grotesque finale was not the end. Killing Wallace was not enough for the Empire. His memory had to be butchered and scattered, his body turned into a permanent, kingdom-wide message. With his heart now ashes, his body was no longer that of a man, it was an instrument of state policy. His head was severed and dipped in tar to preserve it from the elements, then mounted high on a pike above London Bridge. It was positioned to face outward, a silent, snarling warning to every traveler, merchant, and diplomat entering England's capital. This is the price of defiance. The rest of his body was quartered, hacked into 4 pieces with axes and knives. Each limb was then dispatched with surgical symbolism to the far corners of the realm. One piece went to Newcastle, near the Scottish border, another to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a town constantly fought over by England and Scotland. A third was sent to Perth, a former centre of Scottish resistance, and the fourth to Stirling, the site of his greatest victory. These were not burials, they were anatomical threats, nailed to castle gates and town walls, left to rot in the open air, exposed to the elements and carrion birds. Each severed limb was a state-sponsored sermon carved in flesh. Yet, in this masterclass of terror, something went wrong for the crown. The strategy, designed to crush the Scottish spirit, began to backfire. Whispers started to spread, whispers not of fear, but of profound awe. This man had endured the most unimaginable punishment the empire could devise, and according to all accounts, he had not begged for mercy. He had not broken. In their obsessive quest to erase him, Edward's regime had inadvertently magnified him. Wallace became not a forgotten corpse, but a symbol of staggering resolve, his silence in the face of agony more powerful than any scream. The dismemberment that was meant to destroy his legacy instead ensured its survival in song, myth, and memory. Edward had intended the execution to be a bloody final chapter, but instead, it became a prologue. The man they had tried to silence by tearing him apart would now echo louder than any king, not as a ghost, but as a fire that refused to be extinguished.